When the average gamer hears Unreal, chances are they'll probably first think of the Unreal Engine, specifically Unreal Engines 3 and 4. In fact, all of the engines have powered many, many games over the years. In some instances, they might also think of Unreal Tournament, the series of multiplayer arena shooters. They're not so popular now, but I digress. Both of these things share a common origin: Unreal. Unreal was one of the big late 90s shooters, rubbing up against games like Quake, Half-Life, Blood, and so on. Unlike those games, however, Unreal has fallen into relative obscurity over the years, and seems to be borderline forgotten by a lot of games media. Despite this, the people who played it back in its heyday will swear to you that it is one of the best FPS single-player campaigns ever created.
That's a pretty big claim.
Which brings me to what I'm trying to accomplish with this video. I want to try and figure out what makes a good Unreal single-player campaign. What would be the ideal sequel or reboot to the Unreal franchise? To answer this, I'm going to do a full analysis on what I like and dislike about every single-player Unreal game, which includes Unreal, its expansion Return to Na Pali, and finally Unreal 2 The Awakening. Here's how this video is going to be structured. I'll cover the four main aspects of each game: structure and story, presentation, gameplay, and level design. In order to compare each of these elements to these games more directly, I'll talk about that single element for each game before moving on to the next one. I'll finish this off by talking about what I think would be the ideal Unreal sequel. Before we get started here, I want to do some recommended viewing. For the original Unreal, I recommend the videos done by LGR and Salokin. For Unreal 2, I recommend the videos done by Full Install, and especially the one by Civvie 11. That one's fucking hilarious. Alright, let's begin. Being a 90s shooter, the story of Unreal is a bit basic. It's more involved than Doom, but less than Half-Life. Here's the basic setup. You're a character known only as Prisoner 849. You are on a ship called the Vortex Rikers to be taken to some place called the Prison Moon for an unknown crime. But considering this is a video game and something has to jumpstart the plot, the ship crash lands on a strange planet called Na Pali. As it turns out, Na Pali isn't doing so good. The natives, whom are called the Nali, have been enslaved by these lizard dudes called the Scar. That's spelled S-K-A-A-R-J, but it's just pronounced Scar. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. It's not Scourge. Or Scourge, or whatever other people are calling it. It's ridiculous. Despite having a semi-tribalistic aesthetic, they're a highly industrialized race, with spaceships and factories and the like. The end goal of the game is to get off the planet, and to do that, you first need to go through the entire Scar mothership and kill their queen. Okay, I know that doesn't sound like the most spectacularly original thing you've ever heard of, but there's a bit more to it than that. The structure of the game is pretty similar to Half-Life, as it tries to create a mostly uninterrupted journey from the beginning of the game to the end. What this means is you'll naturally stumble across a variety of environments as you travel along. Each of these areas will have their own micro-stories that you can find out about, and this is where things start to get a bit more interesting. You'll read up on these micro-stories through a device called a universal translator. You'll know to use it whenever you hear this. The game really starts to come to life on this little screen here. You'll learn about the Nali's religious beliefs, Scar operations, backstory on your current area, and so on. Through these translator nodes and a general observation of the area, unfolds what I would consider to be the greatest theme of this game: discovery. You uncover ancient temples, trespass on corporate biospheres, and reveal secret underground alien bases, and etc, etc. Sometimes they don't flesh out the backstory to the area as much as they could. Like in any of the temple levels, you get practically nothing story-wise other than find the exit. Other times the micro-stories around these areas are pretty well developed, like in the crashed cargo ship, the ISV Cran. There's a whole heap of backstory on this crew that had to fight off a horde of Scar. Of course they failed miserably, but it was a noble effort nonetheless. Or in Na Pali Haven, the town is supposedly this safe haven where the Nali are allowed to retain their freedom despite continued Scar occupation. Obviously this is a lie, and they're basically prepared to kill all of them once they've outlived their usefulness. I actually really like the way the Scar are portrayed in this game. They do a good job of demonstrating the fact that they're seriously bad dudes. Like, anytime you, a Scar, and a Nali are in the same room, they immediately try to kill the Nali so that they can't help you. More importantly, they have one of the greatest enemy introductions in the history of video gaming. up there with the reveal of the zombie in Resident Evil. Here, just take a look. Oh yeah, and you can also see them literally crucifying the Nolly. So, yeah, they're not the best of friends. There's also a few other races they've either subjugated or allied with that they send to fight you, like the Crawl or these brutes here, but they're not very well developed. I just wanted to bring them up so that you didn't think the Crawl were like just weird mutant Scar. But yeah, the story's pretty good if you're just coasting through the game casually. But if you're actually paying close attention, things can get questionable. Okay, so the most major element of the story is that the Scar have enslaved the Nolly, right? Well, that starts to have some problems when you find out that the Nolly have magical abilities, namely levitation and teleporting. Okay, I don't care how pacifist your race is, you're gonna have a hard time enslaving an entire species if they can just teleport away on a whim. I mean, maybe they could get a hold of them if it takes time and concentration, but even then, what's stopping them from teleporting out of the mines they're forced to work in while the guards aren't looking? They did exactly that in my playthrough. I maybe could have bought it if some of them had collars or something that prevented them from teleporting, but as is, it's a bit hard to stomach. Let's talk about the mines a bit. So the main thing that the quote-unquote captive Nolly are forced to mine is this rare mineral called Teridium, which is apparently valuable enough to justify enslaving an entire species over. But what the hell does this stuff do? I don't know. The game never tells you. Unreal Wiki didn't give me anything either.
You get nothing! You lose! Good day, sir!
The only thing we really know about Teridium is it's used for ammunition on this gun called the Stinger, and the byproduct in the refining process is so hard to dispose of that they just weaponized it because they couldn't think of anything better to do with this stuff. So we've enslaved an entire species so that we could mine bullets? Why not just use a regular nail gun that doesn't use an incredibly rare mineral as ammunition? The gun's not even that amazing or anything. I don't know, maybe there's some lore nut in the comments who knows the answer, but I sure as hell don't. Another thing, there's this plant research center about a third of the way through the game or so, except it doesn't really make any sense being there. For one, it's overrun with Teridium sludge, even though all they do here is study plants. I don't know who runs it or why. I just know it's definitely not affiliated with the Scar because you can see one trying to break into the entrance. I guess that would explain why it's crawling with mercenaries to protect the premises from invading Scar. Except that makes even less sense because why would this plant company decide to put their research base on a planet that's being controlled by a malicious warmongering species? That sounds like the textbook definition of bad idea. There seems to be no shortage of habitable planets in this universe. Why not just put it, somewhere else? Alright, I could do at least 5 more rants like this, but I gotta stop. There's other shit to talk about. Okay, one more real quick. Scar pupae enemies are the larval form of the Scar, which means they're literally weaponized infants. Okay, now I'm done. There's a few minor issues I also have with the story structure, not conceptually but in execution. I know Unreal fans don't like it when you do this, but I feel I need to make some comparisons to Half-Life to get my point across. So I already mentioned that Unreal adopts a similar structure of a generally uninterrupted journey, correct? Well, I kind of feel Half-Life handled it a little better. Like, everything seems to more naturally flow into each other in that game. In Unreal, it's like Quake, where each map is basically self-contained, with a few minor exceptions, but they just more directly tie them together through its map transitions. The result is sometimes you walk 5 feet and suddenly,
now I'm in a completely different place!
It's not so bad in the first half of the game because they use these transitional villages, but even then, they're not always done that well. Like, for example, Nork's Elbow is just a 90-degree chasm from one level to the next. The result is that progression can sometimes feel just a bit video gamey, which is a real shame considering how good this game's atmosphere is otherwise. But more on that later. Another thing I feel Half-Life did better is the way some of the plot is presented. It likes to tell you some objectives that are related to the plot. I mean, you're gonna have to do it anyway to progress, and you never have to go out of your way to accomplish it, so you can just ignore the plot entirely if you want to. They just wanted to add some weight to the stuff you're doing. A good place they could have done this is on the ISV Cran. Instead of just saying, yo, there's a teleport pad at the opposite end of the ship, they could have made it so that you had to activate a self-destruct so that the Scar wouldn't be able to get their hands on some, like, secret weaponry or whatever. Just some stuff along those lines could have added a little more weight to the plot so that it isn't just get to the end of the game. With that last point said, I feel that's a pretty good segue into the expansion, Return to Na Pali. I feel like I didn't really need to say the name there, because you just saw it on the screen, but whatever. This campaign has a much more involved story, with there being a few voiced NPCs at rare intervals.
UMS Bodega Bay, requesting a priority translite communication with UMS Sector Control.
Bodega Bay, this is Starlight Base, go ahead.
As well as even giving your once silent protagonist an audio log in between levels.
A day after my so-called rescue, and I'm going back to the surface of the planet.
For the first half of the campaign, it actually feels a lot like it fixes most of the problems I had with the story structure of the main game. With the inclusion of a little bit of dialogue, they give you an actual story-based objective other than beat the game. That being, you're commissioned by the military to retrieve weapon logs from a crashed spacecraft called the UMS Prometheus. In exchange, you'll get a full pardon and a one-way ticket back to Earth. Sweet deal. Levels lead into each other in a pretty natural progression up until you finally reach the Prometheus. I suppose it makes sense that it improves the story by taking influence from Half-Life's methods, considering this expansion released after that game came out, whereas the main game actually came out a few months before Half-Life. So, you get the weapon logs, but what's this? Looks like you've intercepted a transmission from those military dudes who hired you earlier.
Bodega Bay, one more thing. Operation Talon Hunter is classified Deep Ultra. Once you've finished your mission, you must implement measures to eliminate any security risks.
Please clarify, Starlight Base.
Bodega Bay, make sure prisoner 849 doesn't come back. Terminate the prisoner once the job is done.
I mean, we can try. What happens if by some plot contrivance she finds this audio log and...
Just do it.
Okay, over.
I've been betrayed.
After that happens, the story just kinda gives up. All the audio logs after this feel a bit phoned in, and the rest of the maps are pretty obviously just here are the levels that were cut from the main game, crudely pasted together. For example, suddenly showing up in a snowy environment after you were just in a foundry located within a tropical jungle. After that, you step on a teleporter pad that conveniently takes you to the last level. The new objective you're given is, once again, beat the game. The expansion doesn't really introduce any new logical errors aside from some wonky map transitions. And, you know, some people will disagree with me on this, but I did enjoy having a bit more involved story. At least when they actually, you know, used it. It's not particularly intrusive either. You can skip all of it if you want.
But what about Unreal 2?
Where do I even begin? Alright, I know this game has its fair share of defenders, a lot of them praising the story, but... yeah, I can't. This story sucks ass. Okay, so this game takes place at some point before or after the first game. We don't get a year or anything like that. It opens with a cutscene of a spaceship landing on this Earth-like planet called Avalon. We touch down, go to a command center, and we're introduced to our player character, John Dalton.
Getting mighty tired of babysitting the ass end of nowhere.
Hey, wait a minute, that's the Oblivion Redguard voice actor.
By the Nine Divines, assault! Assault!
That's actor Michael Mack. His performance in this game is pretty good, but unfortunately everyone who's played both games will be able to notice it's the same guy immediately. It's not really a criticism though, considering this game came out 3 years before Oblivion, so it's not like they knew. Just figured I'd point that out. Okay, back on subject. This cutscene just introduces you to John Dalton and Commander Hawkins, then you're immediately flown back up to your cruiser, the TCA Atlantis. This is where you're introduced to the main cast. Nabon is your pilot. He's not the best English speaker.
Marshal, sir, I am saluting you. It is many pleasures to be bustling with you aboard this fine ship.
Yeah, that's about his whole character. Then there's Isaac. He's the best character simply for the fact that his voice actor does this amazing Chainsmoker voice the entire time.
If
If we were a marine ship, we wouldn't have to wait around for parts. I'm making a new art form out of scrounging.
He fixes up the ship and also handles your arsenal. Before each mission, you can go to him and have him explain your weapons to you.
The T-13 pop gun is your standard law enforcement sidearm. Doesn't need ammo. Recharges from a quantum pack in the handle.
If any other voice actor tried to do this, I wouldn't bother listening, but having Chainsmoker Guy tell me this stuff is actually pretty entertaining. Then we have Ida. I could make a joke about how she's dressed, but it's been done many a time before, so I won't. The main stuff Ida does is she gives you your mission briefings and chastises you for taking any kind of initiative.
Your job's done. The fighting Scar isn't in the mission profile. Do not tell me you are going to arm those charges.
Okay, I won't tell you that.
Since we're on the subject, we might as well just talk about the characters. They're undercooked as hell. Okay, so they're each supposed to have their own backstories. Like, Isaac flipped out while he was in the military and accidentally got Ida's friends killed. After that, he retreated to alcoholism for a while. Naban is supposed to be one of 50 princes, so he's been sheltered his whole life, even though he's not even in line for the throne. Ida is considered a war hero because she hatched a plan to stop some alien dudes during an event called the Strider Wars, but the plan also got a few hundred innocents killed in the process. And that's all well and good, but it's completely telling no show. Like, the game says Ida treats Isaac like scum after what happened, but we get one, maybe two lines this whole game that actually reinforce that.
If not, you'll probably find him in his cabin sleeping one off.
If your coworker has a history of drinking on the job, then you don't need a backstory involving manslaughter for that line to make sense. They couldn't even be bothered to stay consistent with Ida's backstory. They say Ida feels like the military made her a monster for what she did, but then later in the game she chastises you for disobeying a military order to shoot an innocent civilian for no reason.
What was I supposed to do? Shoot him?
You didn't even like the guy.
Yeah, but he trusted me.
These backstories aren't introduced in an interesting way either. Every single one of them is just revealed by someone having a conversation with Naban. Now's a good time to mention this game doesn't let you skip cutscenes. So, not only are these backstories executed poorly, but it's all irrelevant bullshit. You could ignore every character backstory in the game and the main plot would be exactly the same. You know why? Because it's just a big fucking MacGuffin hunt. The main plot is just, you need to find 7 ancient artifacts, that's it. Oh yeah, and Commander Hawkins betrays you and takes them all for himself. Which is such a non-twist, it's not even funny.
Drexler has had nothing to do with any of this. It's all been Hawkins.
If you're asking yourself, who the fuck is Drexler? That's a good question. We know he's a general, but he never shows up in this game. They forgot to put their red herring character in the fucking game. Look at this cutscene.
I believe in duty too, Hawkins, and now I know what mine is.
Okay, for real though, what do I like about this story? Well, I'm not opposed to having a more involved story conceptually. Wolfenstein The New Order showed that an involved story can have a place in a more old-school FPS. It's just executed so poorly that I wish they didn't bother, or at least make it basic and unobtrusive like in Return to Na Pali. Also, possibly contrary to popular opinion, I kinda like that they made it a planet-hopping adventure as opposed to a single uninterrupted journey. Don't get me wrong, I certainly don't dislike the journey formula, and I've had serious issues with games that shoehorned in a mission-based structure, but I think this game's structure adds more environmental variety, which they make really good use of. Plus, the usage of your spaceship helps keep it from feeling too video gamey. In the end, I think it's fine. Some like it, some don't. It's subjective. I think both could work for an Unreal game. I like most of Dalton's dialogue. Some of his reactions to stuff gave me a chuckle.
Remember now, search and rescue. No rough stuff.
Yes, Mother.
What's going on up there? Report! Temporary weapons malfunction, sir. The femerite transducer blew, but we cross-patched it with the trilithium ionizer. Who is this? Who am I? Who are you? Unit and serial number, soldier, on the double.
What's taking so long?
Jesus, you're a pain in the ass.
I should have called the Marines!
They're few, they're proud, and they ain't here!
As long as they kept the gameplay closer to Unreal 1, I wouldn't be mad if they said Dalton is the protagonist of the next Unreal game. That, unfortunately, brings me to my next point. What the fuck does this game have to do with Unreal? Here, allow me to list off all of the things in Unreal 2 that return from the first game. The Scar, the Dispersion Pistol, and yeah, that's it. The Scar aren't even the major enemies anymore. You only fight them at the very beginning and very end of the game. They do have a cool homage to the original game Scar introduction sequence though. Too bad it's made meaningless because they otherwise feel very hastily thrown in.
How do the Scar fit in?
They know we want them, so they want them too.
Did they write this story in an hour? Actually, no, that wouldn't even be an excuse. I can think of a better explanation right now. Look, the artifacts are a super weapon, right? Well, at the end of the first game, it's revealed that the Scar are trying to create genetically engineered super soldiers. Is it really that much of a stretch to say that a society like that would want to get its hands on a super weapon? Remember how I mentioned that there was some stuff in Unreal 1's story that didn't make much sense if you were paying enough attention? Every fucking sequence in this game is like that. Seriously, point at any plot element in this game and I could probably tell you something about it that doesn't make sense. Why is the Izanagi Corporation sinking so much money into terraforming a planet that requires they kill a literally planet-sized creature before it can be effectively colonized? Why is this fire still burning in this one oddly specific spot if it started 18 hours ago? Why did Leandri decide to only hire females on their mercenary force? Why did they say that the Izanagi mercs follow a Japanese code of honor, but when you meet them, they're all just regular American grunts? How was the Scar able to take over and enslave an entire planet in the last game if they're supposed to have a highly tribal structure and only recently started working together? Why is the story in this video game so bad? You know what this game needs? A codex. It's obsessed with a bunch of plot and lore that's not directly relevant to the main events of the game, and it has to plug a whole bunch of plot holes, both of which are basically what a codex is designed for. That way they can shove as much useless lore that they want into this game, and they don't have to force us to listen to it during briefings or lore dumps with Naban. Alright, I'm gonna stop this right now. This story is hot garbage, and I could do a whole video talking about everything wrong with it, but we gotta move on. As you could probably guess, this game is old, so you obviously can't really expect Crysis-level graphical fidelity. You wouldn't be thinking that at the time though. The game was so confident in its graphics that it's become famous for its Flight Castle demo that you can see every time you boot up the game. Unreal makes really good use of its lighting engine to create some really cool looking environments. It tends to use darkness a lot to create some ambience, and just to make sure you don't ruin it for yourself, it limits your light sources to disposable flares and some flashlights with very limited battery life. Just in general, the art direction in this game is really well done. Look at the color palettes on some of these environments. Human areas make sparse use of flashy, primary colors within dark corridors. Nolly ruins lean towards muted browns and blues. And Scar Tech is a lot of green and gray. The Unreal Engine also had a leg up from its competitors in one very special aspect: map size. The original Unreal Engine had the capacity to create huge environments that even today have a pretty impressive scale. Granted, they're not packed with detail or anything, but with these simplistic graphics, you tend to let your imagination fill in the blanks. Now, not everything in this game is aged flawlessly. Some of the character models are kind of hilarious. Your guns can look a bit like paper mache. Also, sometimes the outdoor environments can look a bit too simplistic. Like, hey, look at this nature-themed hallway I'm walking down. I don't have much more to mention about the visuals, but I do have to give a special mention to the game's absolutely fantastic soundtrack. Most of it was composed by two guys, Alexander Brandon and Michel Vandenbos, although a couple were done by Andrew Sega and Dan Gordape. Some of it is slow and contemplative. Other tracks try to inspire this sense of wonder as you explore the environment. But sometimes the music just decides to be awesome. This is just an expansion to Unreal, so as you could probably guess, it doesn't change too much. The UMS Prometheus isn't that stylistically consistent with the other human areas in the game, but I can easily forgive that. I guess I should mention that it's really obvious that the new weapons were made by a different studio 2 years later. They just have a way higher model and texture quality than every other gun in the game. Now, some of you may be saying, but isn't that a good thing? Not really. I'd rather things consistently look a bit shit than have a few things randomly look higher quality than everything else. But whatever, I got over it. The new music was also done by the same guys, and it feels a bit more consistently upbeat than the main game. I'm cool with that. And yeah, that's about it for Return to Na Pali.
But what about Unreal 2?
If at any moment the devs sat down and decided what had to be in their Unreal sequel, it was good environmental design. And you know what? The fucking Mad Lads pulled it off. Mostly. The Unreal Engine 2 wasn't nearly as good about map size as the first Unreal Engine, made even worse by the fact that they also built this game knowing it would be on the Xbox. So maps are either small, sparsely detailed, or shrouded in fog to mask the terrible draw distance. I mean, at least outdoor areas now have displacement surfaces, so we won't have another problem with nature-themed hallways. But yeah, they try their hardest within the limitations they were given, and it usually works. There's certainly a lot more variety than Unreal 1, since it takes place across multiple planets. The one that everyone loves to point out in this game is the planet that's completely covered by a single giant organism. I mean, I already established that that doesn't really make sense within the context of the story, although it does look cool. As for other examples, there's this weird purple alien jungle. I like the snowy moon colony with the blue gas giant in the skybox, even if you only get to see it for like a minute. The standout highlight for me was the Geiger base though. Remember how I said that discovery was a good word to describe the feel you get when playing Unreal? This is the only time in the game that I really got that vibe. The more Earth-like areas aren't quite as good though. I suppose Avalon looks neat, but then we have Sanctuary Mining Facility, which is just a regular industrial area with a boring color palette. Severnaya Dam is a little better thanks to some well-designed set pieces, but still not great. You also don't get any kind of a flashlight, but you'll never need it because this game doesn't really have that many dark spaces. It can kneecap the atmosphere at times, but from a level design perspective I don't entirely miss it, but we'll get to that. I guess that leaves the music. This time it was mostly composed by Jack Wall and Jeremy Soule. Long story short, the music is almost always a downgrade from Unreal 1. A lot of it is pretty generic ambience. Sometimes they will decide to have a bit more fun though. But a few of the tracks are genuinely awesome, and what a surprise, the best ones are all composed by Alexander Brandon. This one was actually cut from the game, which is a shame because it's one of the best ones. Apparently it was used in the 2000 tech demo for Unreal Engine 2. Alright, moving on. Alright, now we're getting into the real meat and potatoes. Unreal's gameplay loop is that of a fast-paced action FPS with exploration elements. On the surface, it's pretty standard fare for your late 90s FPS. You wander around, you shoot things at blindingly fast speeds, and then you leave. There were two things about Unreal that made it stand out from the crowd, however, and that was its enemy AI and weapon lineup. I'll start with the enemy AI, cause that'll take less time. The enemies behave in ways that make it actually somewhat challenging to face up against them without just making them bullet sponges. Here, look at this scar. In any other FPS, you just mow this guy down. Watch what he does in this fight here. That's right, he's got the agility to dodge your projectiles. This means you'll have to actually be smart about how you use your projectile weapons instead of just spam him with rockets, which is kind of ironic when you consider the fact that you have a rocket launcher that is specifically designed for spamming. Not every enemy does this though. Brutes will never dodge any of your attacks, but they usually just show up at the earlier parts of the game, so that's fine. Other enemies such as the Crawler will dodge sparingly, so you'll still need to pay attention to what you're doing, but you won't be trained from trying to fight jumpy ass enemies all day. There's a few other aspects that just make them feel more aware than your average shooter enemy. Like they seem to adjust their tactics based on what weapon you're firing. Also sometimes the Scar will feign their own death and get back up and try to kill you. That makes this the only game I've played where I need to do confirmation kills. There's also some friendly NPCs in this game in the form of the Nolly, who will help you out by opening secret doors for you. They won't help you if they're scared of you, however, and I found it pretty inconsistent when it wants to work or not. Sometimes they can take a hit and be fine, sometimes they're scared after taking damage from you, sometimes they're scared after taking damage from anything, sometimes they're scared after you shoot a gun near them, sometimes they're just scared for no reason. This is really frustrating when you want them to reveal a secret for you. I just wish they had some consistency and would maybe man up a little. Alright, let's talk about the weapons. Let's just go through the whole arsenal, cause fuck it, I'm insane. The Dispersion Pistol is your first weapon. Doesn't need ammo, recharges from a quantum pack in the handle. Your primary fire shoots out a slow-moving projectile, and your alt fire will charge up a sustained burst until you let go. It can be upgraded a multitude of times to improve its damage output, but you'll mostly use it to break boxes. The Automag pistol is a worthy tool for any fight. Primary fire is pretty standard for a pistol, while alt firing allows for an increased fire rate at the cost of accuracy. Good at a distance and up close. It's also the only weapon that needs to reload, and there unfortunately isn't a dedicated reload key, you just have to empty your magazine. The R key is locked to Team Say. The Stinger's primary fire functions similarly to the nail gun from Quake, shooting fast-moving projectiles at a high rate of fire. Alt fire throws out a volley of 5 shards at an enemy, albeit with poor accuracy. A favorite for some, but I tended to use it less and less towards the late game. The ASMD shock rifle is the ultimate medium-range weapon. Primary fire shoots out a railgun shot, alt fire throws out a slow-moving orb at an enemy. If you're good, you can shoot this orb out of the air to create a huge explosion. A dependable weapon, although sometimes I feel the primary fire feels a bit weak. But I could just suck.
Maybe if you didn't miss so often, you'd have more ammo.
The rather poorly named 8-ball gun is one of the most powerful rocket launchers this side of the cosmos. Primary fire loads up to a maximum of 6 rockets. Alt fire loads up grenades instead. A great tool if you really just want something dead. Behold the myth, the legend, the flak cannon. If you've played Unreal, it's your favorite gun. Don't lie. Primary fire shoots out a load of shrapnel that can bounce off walls. Alt fire lobs a grenade which will also throw out shrapnel upon detonation. It can kill almost any enemy in 1 or 2 shots from point-blank range. The Razor Jack is a bit of a silly weapon. It shoots out a spinning razor disc that bounces off walls, but retains its speed. So if you're not careful, you can accidentally hit yourself with it. Alt fire toasts the weapon sideways, altering its bounce angle. Not the greatest indoor weapon, if you're not that good with it. The GES Bio Rifle is a rather experimental weapon. Primary fire shoots volleys of toxic waste at your opponent. Alt fire builds up a sustained burst of sludge until you let go of the button. A deadly tool, if a bit situational. The Sniper Rifle... well, the Sniper Rifle is literally exactly what you would expect a Sniper Rifle to be. Also, check out this headshot animation. The minigun, well, again, it's a minigun. Primary fire shoots bullets, alt fire shoots bullets, but faster. It doesn't do quite as much damage as you would expect, but that's probably so that you don't overuse it on the Scar, which are designed for projectile combat. So, yeah, some of the weapons in there can get pretty interesting. And every single one of them has an alt fire, which is awesome. Other stuff of note, the game doesn't have a use key. You have to bump levers and buttons to use them. That's considered weird now, but at the time it was pretty common practice. You get used to it, but it is a little awkward sometimes. The game's also really long. Like, I think it took me 14 hours to get through my first playthrough. I'm all for games having a bunch of content, but it can get a bit draining by the end because you're basically doing the exact same stuff you've been doing the whole game. It actually does mix it up some in the last chapter, but I'm talking more just before that. Real quick, something I forgot to mention when I first wrote the script is there is a dodge mechanic in Unreal where if you double tap one of the directional keys, then you will dodge in that direction. This can be useful for some players, however I didn't really get much use out of it because I found it really inconvenient and tricky to try and double tap the key every time I wanted to dodge. I just never found it to be that convenient for me, so I didn't use it. Yeah, combat's real good. Enemy variety is good. I forgot to mention this earlier, but most enemies have subclasses, which have slightly different stats and behaviors. Like, I think there's something like 6 variation on these regular Scar Warriors, and another 6 on these Trooper enemies. The Crawl I know come in a regular and elite flavor. There's 3 different types of these Brute enemies. There's a lot of enemies, is what I'm getting at. As you might guess, there's not nearly as much to talk about here, considering that being an expansion, it's just more of the same. There's a few new guns to bring up. The Combat Assault Rifle is an assault rifle. Primary fire shoots bullets at a ridiculously high rate of fire. Alt fire shoots out an accurate explosive round. This weapon feels really good to use, but I think it's a bit too reliable. You get it at the beginning of the campaign, and for the first half or so, you go through this routine of, do I have ammo for my assault rifle? If yes... It's made even worse by the fact that the Scar have absolutely no idea how to deal with the thing. They're made to deal with projectile weapons, not this bullshit. I think this weapon could have had the same reload mechanic that the Automag had, just to give it an additional caveat. They also add a rocket launcher and a grenade launcher, even though you still have access to the 8-ball gun, which does both. I suppose they do each have their own alt-fire modes. Rocket launcher allows you to shoot guided rockets, and the grenade launcher lets you shoot out bombs that you detonate with the second press of the alt-fire button. The grenade launcher is actually decent once you get used to its weird arc. The rocket launcher is okay too. The projectile is faster and does more damage than a single 8-ball rocket, except that the 8-ball gun can shoot 6, which kinda makes up for its shortcomings. As for new enemies, we've got giant spider enemies, which is cliche as fuck, but their behavior makes them feel like a pretty worthy addition to the roster. There's also one and only one sequence in this game where you're forced to fight human enemies. They use the combat assault rifle, and they're complete bullshit. In the main Unreal campaign, you find maybe 3 enemies armed with a hit scan weapon, and you're always given cover, and they're not even very accurate with it. But here, they spray bullets and have the accuracy of an Olympic sniper, and this is the arena you fight them in. You see any cover anywhere? How the fuck are you supposed to avoid taking damage from these guys? It's not that big of a deal, honestly. You do it once, you're done, then you move on. Speaking of moving on...
But what about Unreal 2?
Hey, so remember how much I liked Unreal 1's gameplay loop and how I thought the combat and weapons were fucking fantastic? Well, Legend Entertainment sure didn't. The gameplay doesn't feel much like a sequel to Unreal. I've heard people say it feels like a copy of Halo, but I've never played a Halo game, so I cannot attest to the accuracy of that. I wouldn't say it doesn't feel like an Unreal game at all, because there's clearly elements of the first game in here, but you do have to dig a little. I suppose I should start with the thing you'll notice the moment you get control of your character. See this? See how fast you're moving? This is your run speed. Your run speed. I feel like a geriatric snail moving at this speed. Luckily, there's a solution. Okay, so open up your console and type in "Be My Monkey," no spaces. There, you've just enabled cheats. Now type in "Set Speed 1.5. Boom, you are now moving at an acceptable running speed. This still isn't as fast as the original Unreal's movement speed, but it works for the size of the levels and the encounters you'll be in. Now you may be saying, hey, shouldn't you be reviewing the game the way it plays normally instead of cheating the whole time? Well, I'm making this retrospective to see what makes a good Unreal game, and slow movement speed sure as hell doesn't. It's not perfect though, you have to re-enter it every time there's a map transition, and sometimes I forget to do it right away. So if my speed is inconsistent in this recording, that's why. Alright, with that out of the way, how is the combat? Well, let's compare Scar. They're now able to reflect bullets, presumably so that they can now actually counter being shot out with the combat assault rifle. It can make them a bit hard to fight at first, but if you shoot a projectile from the assault rifle at their feet, the shards from it will bounce back into their legs and they'll take damage. But yeah, the Scar otherwise seem to work pretty similarly to how they do in Unreal 1. Maybe a bit less clever, but they just don't work as well in this game because your Arsenal and the Scar are no longer work in congruence with each other. Fighting them is even worse if you don't cheat your movement speed to be faster, because you'll be too slow to effectively get away from them and they'll just constantly be in your face. Not that any of that matters because you're not going to be fighting them for most of the game. For most of the game, you're going to be fighting basic human mercs with guns. Or giant spiders. Let's talk about the weapons. Actually, we'll let Isaac talk about the weapons, because Isaac's the best. You know, minus the time that he was accidentally racist.
But if he's so smart, why doesn't he learn our language?
This is alien racism!
Anyway, take it away, Chainsmoker guy.
The T-13 pop gun is your standard law enforcement sidearm. Doesn't need ammo, recharges from a quantum pack in the handle. Primary fire is a slow-moving energy pulse. Alt fire charges up a stronger pulse until you release it. A dependable fallback weapon, but not much use in a crowd. The M32 Duster fires depleted uranium shards that don't have shells, but build up a nasty dust that gets ejected between clips. Primary fire spits out rounds at a very high automatic rate. Alt fire is a cluster of 5 shards packed together to form a single, slower-moving slug. The slug breaks apart when it hits a wall, so if you're good, you can even shoot around corners. The M406 grenade launcher has slots for 6 different grenade types. Tapping your primary fire lobs out a grenade that explodes on contact. Holding the trigger a little longer engages the timing mechanism so you can bounce them around some. Secondary fire chambers the next grenade type if you've got any. This is an M700 12-gauge semi-automatic shotgun. Absolutely lethal close-up and pretty damn good at mid-range. The alt-fire puts out explosive incendiary slugs with a wider spread and a more limited range. I modified one of the Azarian energy rifles to make it more powerful. Primary fire generates 2 plasma bolts that don't do much damage, but the refire rate is high, which lets you put a lot of hits on a target in a short amount of time. Alt-fire creates an EMP field that will seriously screw up any machinery it hits. Oh, I had me some fun with this one. Turns out the arachnids you ran into on Hell have a really durable biomass. I loaded some into this ejaculator tube. Primary fire spits out a sac that'll spawn a bunch of little arachnids on your target. With alt-fire, the sac will grow until it splits and a big sucker pops out and goes on the attack. Its name pretty much says it all. The Vulcan uses canisters of napalm for ammo and shoots out a spray of flaming gas. Just point and shoot to incinerate a whole crowd of enemies in close quarters. Alt-fire is a spray of unignited napalm that'll stick to any surface. You can set it off with primary fire or with one of your other weapons, but it's unstable enough that after a few seconds it'll probably ignite anyway. Ida's had her forever. She's a really sweet weapon. 50 caliber explosive ammunition. Very accurate and very powerful. Alt-fire is a 3-round burst that takes a little longer to reload. Self-propelled rockets with 4 thrusters and explosive warheads that fuse on impact. Primary fire is 4 missiles bound together as 1 rocket, but I've changed the alt-fire into something even the mercs don't have. Here's how it works. Hold down the alt-fire trigger and identify up to 4 targets by holding each one in your crosshairs until you hear a beep. Then release the trigger, and the 4 missiles will each seek one of the targets. Any missiles that don't have a target will just follow a drunken path. A beautiful precision instrument with a variable zoom. It's got a computerized targeting system that compensates for wind and other variables to put a 50 caliber slug within an inch of where you aim it from 2 clicks away. Alt-fire toggles you in and out of zoom mode, and you can use the wheel control to zoom in further. Ammo is generally hard to come by, so don't waste it. I figured out a control mechanism for those floating orbs you found on Nakoja Abad. Your primary fire launches the orb at an enemy, so it circles around him and shoots at him. The alt-fire is a defensive mode. The orb will circle you and try to shoot down any inbound projectiles. I put this thing together from bits and pieces you found in the labs on Nakoja Abad. It uses a proto-dracpod for ammo, and its primary fire is a laser pulse, sort of like a conventional railgun. The alt-fire is a limited-range, sustained beam you can use to hose down a room full of bad guys.
So yeah, you might have noticed something. That's not the most impressive lineup of weapons compared to the last one. I mean, you have a few interesting ones, like the spider gun. Unfortunately, the spider gun is literally the most useless weapon I've ever seen in a video game. There's also the shock lance, which is like a weird combination of the razor jack and the shock rifle from the last game. It's okay, I guess, but I never saw a good reason to use it over my other weapons. I find myself a bit baffled that they decide to just ignore the weapons from the last game, even going so far as to replace the flat cannon with a regular shotgun. It does, however, still give every weapon an alt-fire, and these they get a bit more interesting with. I don't think I've ever seen a shotgun shoot a wall of flames at an enemy before. Combat with human enemies is pretty standard. If you don't have a problem fighting Combine soldiers in Half-Life 2, then you probably won't have a problem with this. I should also mention that there's a really kick-ass boss fight towards the end of the game, though it might only be good because I cheated my movement speed to be faster, I don't know. Either way, it was actually sufficiently enjoyable. They also tend to divide up their enemy subclasses with simple light, medium, and heavy variations. This goes for the Scar and the human enemies. Knowing the wide variety of Scar they had in the first game, part of me is a bit annoyed they just divided it up into 3 enemy types. But at the same time, this means each of those enemy types have much more distinct behaviors, whereas in Unreal 1, they all just sort of gel together in your mind. So I think it's a fine change. Exploration is just straight up gone. There's no secret hunting or anything like that in this game. I'm pretty sure this little guy right here is the only secret that you can find in this entire game. And yeah, I don't have anything else to add, so moving on. So I mentioned in the gameplay segment that Unreal's gameplay heavily relies on exploration, right? Well, the level design certainly accentuates that. The general idea driving Unreal's level design is that of interconnectivity and non-linearity. Usually. Some of these maps are pretty linear, especially the earlier ones, but there will always be out-of-the-way spaces for you to find interesting goodies, or maybe some lore. When it works, this makes for a really engaging and immersive experience that still holds up today. When it works. See, this game had a number of level designers, each working on their own maps independently, I think at least 5 or 6. Some of them I felt made some really awesome maps, others not so much. When the non-linear formula is working at its best, you get Bluff Eversmoking. When it's at its worst, you get Sunspire. I'll start with Bluff Eversmoking. Let's open with some positivity. The reason this map handles non-linearity so well over the other maps is actually very simple. It makes each route that is required to progress easy to find, but still lets you discover everything in the level at your own pace. What this means is you will naturally and easily discover the way forward through just a little bit of exploration. Everything just seems to open up naturally. Progression blockers are clear and obvious. When you find one, you can use your knowledge of previously explored areas to figure out how to turn it off. Oh yeah, and they're also really careful to avoid situations where you flip a lever only to think,
"What the fuck did that switch do?"
They do this by either letting you see directly what it did, or have a computer terminal nearby that tells you. What I'm trying to get at here is that they make it a point to give you all the information you need to figure out where to go next. It's really well done. Alright, now we gotta talk about Sunspire. For the first half of this map, my issues can be summed up as extraneous spaces and pitch black darkness. 90% of the first half doesn't matter. There's nothing special you can find in there, it's all just there to waste your time. Okay, so you're trying to get to this place called the Great Hall, which you can only find through one corridor. You know where you find this entrance? In a pitch black wine closet. What kind of fucking monastery is this? Who puts the entrance to the most important part of the building in a room like that? If you don't throw a flare in this room, you literally will not see this corridor. It is too dark. So meanwhile, you're running through all of the 50 other rooms with nothing in them, looking for the exit, when in reality, you might have passed it already and it was too dark to see. It's not even like the area becomes fun on a repeat playthrough either. If you know where to go, there's actually an elevator that lets you skip all of it, and you can just skip the whole thing in a minute, so what's the point? Okay, so you eventually find the corridor and make it to the Great Hall. You go to the next room, a lift is supposed to drop down, and it doesn't come. Here's what you're supposed to do. See the underside of that balcony? Okay, so knowing the ship that the mapper just pulled, I'll give you one guess as to what he's going to do now. That's right, he hid even more progression critical stuff in pitch black darkness. It's made even worse this time by the fact that the lever you're supposed to flip doesn't even look like a lever, but that's partially because the game's just old and sometimes stuff happens. But wait, we're not done. We gotta talk about this crystal puzzle. This is the one I hear a lot of people complain about. The crystal puzzle is a classic case of
"What the fuck did that switch do?"
It's supposed to call an elevator from the sky that will take you to the next area. Let me just explain to you, step by step, why it don't work. You find the room that activates the crystal before you find the room that is affected by it. The effect it uses with the crystal gives the impression that I just turned something on permanently rather than calling an elevator. You can't actually see the effects of the crystal from the point of activation. If you activate it and then don't immediately go to where the sky elevator drops down, it'll leave you and you won't see it. Even though it gives you a pretty hefty hint that even name drops the sky elevator, it doesn't make sense given your current knowledge of the game. I didn't know what to expect from the game, but I certainly never expected a magic floating elevator from the sky. I thought it was referring to the elevator that got you to the top floor. You do get this sign that says prepare to embark, but I didn't have any context for it when I first read it, so I just sat there thinking, hey sign, I don't know if you noticed this, but
We're in the middle of nowhere!
Players also never have a reason to look up in the game, so it's a bit high of a demand to expect them to just decide to come over here and look up into the sky.
I'm looking. I'm looking.
But you're not looking
I'm
like
looking
up.
here.
You're not looking in like all directions. You're
Oh,
there.
it's the Sky Ferry.
There you go.
But yeah, I wound up flipping the crystal switch like 5 or 6 times before figuring out what it did on my first playthrough. You might think it's pointless for me to go on a rant about one puzzle like this, but this game has a ton of obtuse puzzles like this. It's usually only in the Nolly Ruin levels, but there's a lot of moments where progression feels arbitrarily gated, and it's especially confusing when you're trying to make your levels non-linear. Speaking of which, there are times that the game does decide to be more linear, and I feel like these also work pretty well within this game. For example, we have one of my favorite levels, Na Pali Haven. You have to worm your way through this Nolly village in the sky, flipping levers that will allow you to access the next part of town. Despite being linear, it's really interconnected and compact, so it still feels like a town, and it gives an amazing sense of space. Oh yeah, and since the story of this place is that the Scar aren't enslaving and slaughtering the Nolly up on these islands, you can find them in pretty casual circumstances. Like, right here, you can just find this Scar in a hotel just trying to take a nap. Dude's just trying to get some shut-eye, and you just bust in like an asshole. I love it. Anyway, you get to the end of the area, and after this big, long, quiet town section, the payoff is this badass romp through a secret Scar base. Awesome. Okay, so I have notes on literally every level in this game, so I could go on and on about each area in this whole campaign. But this script is already 30 pages long, so I gotta wrap this up. I guess the point that I'm trying to get at here is that I approve of non-linear, heavily interconnected level design if the person making it knows what they're doing, and at least in this game, they usually do. If they don't, then it can easily be marred by obtuse progression and puzzles, and at that point I would rather just have something linear. There's not much to say about Return to Na Pali's level design, but there certainly is a different feel to it than the original. It feels more safe, perhaps? It almost never has areas that are particularly dark. That does mean we won't have a repeat of the Sunspire problem, but I don't mind dark spots so long as they don't interfere with progression. Most importantly, levels seem to be a lot more consistently linear. There's a couple non-linear areas, but they're not particularly ambitious in their design. Like Gallus Peak, for instance, which is just a pile of samey-looking rooms in a lodge. Most areas seem to use loops to try and give it a sense of interconnectivity, and there's still out-of-the-way spaces for you to find goodies and whatnot, but they're pretty easy to miss on your first playthrough. A lot of areas feel like a rehash of locales from the main game. Edge of Na Pali feels like a longer version of the area just outside of Vortex Strikers, right down to a remixed music track. There's also a village that feels like a more lame version of Na Pali Haven, using a lot of similar design elements, but ultimately feeling much less memorable. Also, when I first tried to play this on my recording session, a script broke on me that would have opened a door, and I didn't remember how the sequence was supposed to play out. I wandered around for like 15 minutes thinking I missed something that I forgot about from my first playthrough. My conclusion with Return to Na Pali's level design is it's not bad. I don't hate that it's more linear. I never feel restricted to a certain path like I do in some modern shooters. But I do feel it's a lot less bold than the main game, and because of that, it isn't nearly as memorable as the campaign it tries to imitate.
But what about Unreal 2?
Hey, take a wild guess what word I would use to describe Unreal 2's level design. If you guess linear, congratulations, you've won 6 satisfaction points. Every level in Unreal 2 is a straight shot to the finish line. No room for exploration, no secret hunting, no out-of-the-way areas, nothing like that. This game is more linear than Half-Life. There's maybe 2 times in this game that you won't feel completely tied down to a very specific route, one of which literally lasts for like 2 minutes. This straitjacket level design really conflicts with how good the environmental design is, because I really want to look into every nook and cranny of these areas. But the devs basically just made one hallway from one end to the other. The most egregious example of this level is appropriately titled Hell. You land on this cool looking frozen moon that I already told you about, then immediately go inside this really generic looking space base. You rescue Adam Jensen in the medical bay.
John Dalton, TCA Marshal. Who are you?
Jensen.
Eventually Jensen dies, and you find out this space base is overrun with giant spiders. Then you have to walk through generic space corridors and shoot spiders in a painfully linear environment for 20 minutes. 20 minutes. This might be one of the most generic, boring, uninspired levels I have played in a shooter. I mean, I guess I've seen worse, but I don't think I've actually played worse. Nobody at Legend Entertainment at any point said, "Hey guys, this level was fucking boring. Could we maybe try something else? Perhaps a level that explores the cold, harsh surface of this frozen moon with the cool skybox?" No, We gotta do spiders? Okay. It's really frustrating to be an amateur level designer and play a game like this that was released by a major development company and was sold for full price and think to myself, I could absolutely do better. The rest of the game never gets as bad, but I still can't believe that's an area that they thought players would actually enjoy. The game also sometimes has these defense segments. They do these 3 times, almost back to back weirdly enough, and I honestly hate defense segments. It really frustrates me when the pace of the game is taken out of my control, and I have to wait for enemies to come to me. I have never found them enjoyable. I guess as defense missions go, they're not too bad, but I just wish they weren't there. But then we get to Severnaya Dam, which is the best dam level in this game. Apparently it was made by a guest level designer, which would explains why it feels so different and kinda tacked on. Ryan Pendleton was the creator. No clue who the hell that is, but he did a good job. It's still linear, but they actually put effort into trying to make it interconnected and flow in an enjoyable way. I don't feel railroaded the way I do with the rest of the game. They also have some pretty cool scripted sequences in here that make the whole thing feel a lot more memorable. All the encounters with the mercs feel really well put together since they give you a reasonable amount of cover. It's also backed with some actual music made by Alexander Brandon. Seriously, all this map needs is some SCAR combat and it would actually feel like an Unreal game. It was only 12 minutes, but it was a good 12 minutes. In conclusion, Unreal 2's level design is lame and boring. Except Severnaya, that one's alright. Okay, first of all, I should mention that I sincerely doubt another single-player Unreal game will ever officially happen. If we're lucky, we might get a fan game, but that's completely up in the air. There's absolutely no way we'll get a game titled Unreal 3 at any point. It's just been too long now, and there's not an overwhelming demand for it like there was with Shenmue 3, or however you pronounce that. The best case scenario I can think of is someone gives a really good pitch for an Unreal reboot, probably just titled Unreal, and Epic decides that they can capitalize on the crowd that likes games like Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal. But even that's doubtful, considering we couldn't even get a new Unreal tournament out the door without Epic Games cancelling it to focus on Fortnite. Anyway, now that I've made you all sad, let's talk about my best case scenario. Some people will disagree with me on some of my ideas, as I imagine for a lot of you the ideal Unreal sequel would look really close to Unreal 1. Hell, for some of you it might look closer to Unreal 2, but here's what I would want based off of what I liked about these games, along with some of my own ideas thrown in there. Structure and story. I don't care much about how the main story actually is, just so long as I get to be alone and amazed in a strange alien world. I would choose a structure that supports a good amount of environmental variety, so it could still be a planet-hopping adventure, but what I think would be even better is trying to figure out how to make an especially varied environment within a single planet. That way we can go back to the ways of fleshing out a more cohesive world with fewer disparate elements, but still have a pretty wide variety of locales. I mentioned something almost similar to a Zelda game, where you'd have this one big hub area, and you have to go to various locations across the map to fulfill various objectives. So, like, not an open world game, but it would still be like a linear story. But you wouldn't have to like wander around looking for side quests or whatever. No, fuck that. I think that it would help with some of the video gamey progression I noticed in the first game, and it would just make the whole world feel a bit more unified. A bit more real. I think you could do a lot of experimenting with the structure of the game. I feel there's a lot of interesting stuff that you could pull off that isn't just go forward and reach the end, or here's a mission, go to this planet and do it. Oh yeah, and add a codex. I really want to just read up on a bunch of lore and shit. Let me learn some informations. As for how involved the actual story is, I think I'd maybe prefer something a bit more involved than Return to Na Pali, but not as much as Unreal 2. And of course allow us to skip the cutscenes to spare the people that don't care. Presentation. I have a really hard time believing that they'd fuck up the presentation. At least on a visual end, that is. If they're using the Unreal Engine 4 and are going for a semi-realistic alien art style, it would work out fine. Just as long as they don't pull an Unreal Tournament 3 and just make the whole thing look like Gears of War. No, fuck that. Just don't slap a big tin filter over everything. Music, I don't know about. If Alexander Brandon or Michel Vandenbos return to do the soundtrack, we'd be golden. I know for a fact Alexander Brandon is still doing music stuff, and he offered to work on the soundtrack for the cancelled Unreal Tournament 4, so I know he'd be up for it. if we don't get either of those two composers, we could also have someone who really liked and respected Unreal 1 soundtrack. So a similar situation to, like, well, I'm talking a lot about Doom 2016 with the ideal sequel stuff. Well, it was a good example of a reboot of a classic FPS franchise. So I think it's a worthy comparison. So yeah, it would be a similar situation to like Mick Gordon composing for Doom 2016. You know, someone who respected the original soundtrack, but you know wants to put a new spin on it. I think that would work fine. Gameplay, really in this department, just make it as close to Unreal 1 as you can. Don't sideline the Scar this time. Please don't. They were actually fun to fight. Maybe take a few cues from Doom 2016 once again with its push forward combat and how that works. Do not add glory kills. I like glory kills in Doom 2016. I don't need them in my Unreal game. That would be dumb. It wouldn't fit. I would definitely like a similar weapon roster to Unreal 1, but I would like some different weapons, some new weapons. Not like boring weapons like Unreal 2, or just useless weapons also like Unreal 2. Like, obviously you would keep the flak cannon, because getting rid of the flak cannon is sacrilege. But part of me feels like when you consider how outstandingly unique Unreal's arsenal of weapons was, it would be really weird to just reuse all of them for the new game. It doesn't feel so unique anymore when you're just copying from your predecessor. I don't know. Definitely keep some of the old weapons, but I'd like to see some new ones with some real creativity put into them. Also, add a fucking melee weapon. I don't understand why none of the Unreal games have one. It's so weird. So many modern FPS games are also moving away from dedicated melee weapons. I don't get it. Melee weapons are awesome. Just put one in and make it a cool, unique one. Level design. I definitely would ideally want it to be some sort of evolution of Unreal 1's level design philosophy, just without the cryptic bullshit in some of the levels. Make sure the player has all the information necessary to figure out the puzzle that you put into your map. Don't literally hide it from their vision. Alternatively, they could also implement some non-linearity through giving the player choices as to how they want to approach a situation, rather than making it about trying to solve a puzzle. I would be fine with either. Just don't do what Unreal 2 did. You know, when I first started writing this script, I honestly thought my ideal Unreal game would look like a pretty homogenized mix between Unreal 1 and 2, but what wound up happening was Unreal 2 just became an example of what not to do 90% of the time. The only time I got even remotely close to Unreal 2 was when I said I wouldn't mind a more involved story than Unreal 1. Oh, by the way, remember how I said that I feel like I could do better with the level design in Unreal 2, particularly with that one level? I might have a chance to prove that because I was looking through the game files in Unreal 2 and I found out that they actually put the level editor, it's the Unreal editor in the actual files itself. So you can just open it up and make a map for the game right off the bat. So yeah, I might play around with that. I'm currently working on a Black Mesa map, self-plug, 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 that I gotta finish that up first before I want to start anything new in that department. But yeah, I might look into that. I might actually make a map for it just to prove that I can make something that's good. Alright, okay, with all that said, I'm gonna call it quits right now. I've officially written a small book on the Unreal games, and I think I might be clinically insane. Good night.